Hey, good evening, everyone. Well, today was a great day, I think, for the prosecution in the Chauvin trial, the death of George Floyd. Prosecution called a Dr. Tobin, who is a renowned pulmonary specialist, and he basically studies the physiology of breathing. I mean, I was just captured by his testimony all morning in terms of how he discussed how the body takes in air and expels air. And he indicated his testimony was clear after all the video he looked at, photos he looked at, measurements that were done, 3D models he made. I mean, this guy has published like over 750 articles on breathing, and he generally charges $500 an hour, but he said he took this case on and is testifying and rendered an opinion and reviewed all the materials. He didn't want any money. He would not take any money for doing it. Let's start with his opinion was that Mr. Floyd, that with the knee as it was, we have to start, let me back up. He talked about in breathing how when you inhale, the muscles in the rib cage and chest as well as the back expand and contract. He testified that with Mr. Floyd being prone and the knee on the back and the neck, but also the position of the officers, the officer had on Mr. Floyd's left arm, bending it up behind him and pressing it into his back. He said all of that led to restricting his breathing, okay? Because the muscle in the chest, because on the ground and the knee on the back and pushing the arm up into the back, it couldn't expand and contract. You couldn't get any of that, okay? And as such, then the diaphragm we know is not working, or and actually what happens when you're having trouble breathing, the way he explained it is frankly at times the lungs, they shrink, they smaller because they can't get the oxygen that's needed. He went further and showed in frames of the video how when Mr. Floyd at one point you could see him trying to bring up his right shoulder. He said that's because he's trying to get air on the right side of his lung because he can't on the left. He talked about how when his finger was on the ground and he was trying to lift up, that was another sign that he was trying to breathe and get air in the right side of the lung. It was simply fascinating testimony to sit there and hear. He had someone, he referred to him as an artist, but whoever it was, they did a 3D model with the police vehicle positioned, Mr. Floyd on the ground, the officers on him, and then they were able to show you by removing the vehicle where the officers were that were on him and how that restricted his breathing. And the fact that at one point when we see Mr. Floyd's legs straighten up and jerk out, he said, that's last gasp. He's now have brain injury from the lack of oxygen, okay, and that he's on the way out. And this man has said he has watched these signs in people who have died. They went to, the prosecutor asked him about fentanyl and the amount of fentanyl in his system. He said that had nothing to do with it. In fact, he was able to show a video clip where he was actually able to count the respirations of Mr. Floyd while he was on the ground. And within a certain time period, a few seconds that they ran it, he said you can count, I believe he said there were 20 respirations. He said if he was on fentanyl, or had that big a dose of fentanyl, and fentanyl was having an effect, his respiration rate would have been at 10. He said it had nothing to do with it. Nothing at all. It was just, I wish if folk can find it on the internet, the testimony of Dr. Tobin, it is really worth listening to. And I mean, the defense attorney really couldn't do anything with him. He's talking to him, and he starts talking about hyperventilating. And Dr. Tobin is, Mr. Floyd wasn't hyperventilating. He just corrected that very quickly. So he shot down any argument that illegal drugs had anything to do with it. And he said that the amount of narcotics in his system, like the fentanyl, he said, for example, was such a low amount, it could be like a, quote, prescribed dose. Other toxicologists, forensic toxicologists that testified, indicated that if the fentanyl had such an effect on him, his breathing would be slow, he'd be sleepy, which clearly we saw that he wasn't. Okay, I mean, this was just, I think this was a very good day for the prosecution. There's really nothing the defense, I think, could do with this testimony that came in today. This is probably, and I think, because, there's going to be some issue about what the medical examiner said and didn't say, what was and wasn't in the report, that what you're going to see is this and some of the toxicology testimony. They're taking it before the autopsy doctor testifies, and I think that's to lay the groundwork. Okay, so those deficiencies from the forensic pathologist who did the autopsy, it's not going to have that big an impact because of what these prior doctors have said and what they have testified to. Dr. Tobin also testified that at one point where we see Mr. Floyd's face, the nose on the ground, while we think that was criminal and harsh, he said actually when he's in that position, he's trying to breathe. And that's why he is in that position. He talked about and could show and stop the video and show at one point he did calculations and measurements, and based on the estimated weight of the utility belt, the gun belt and whatnot that Officer Chauvin had on, and Officer Chauvin's body weight, doing his weight, subtracting out shin bone, boots, etc., etc. He says at one point where you see Officer Chauvin's right foot, the toe of the boot off the ground, he said at this point he has all of his weight on his neck, which he calculated to be 90 pounds, of weight on his neck. He blew out any argument about carbon dioxide levels, high carbon dioxide levels. He said, you're going to see that in that high range because the body can't expel it. You breathe in the oxygen, it goes to the alveoli, and I may have mispronounced that, in the lungs, like little stems and grapes that are on there. And the diaphragm pushes up and expels the carbon dioxide. He says, but when you're in that position, you can't do it. And when you're dying and can't do it, that's it. He was even able to point out in the video where it's what he called the last breath that Mr. Floyd took. So, like I said, they couldn't do much with him today. And I say to people get upset with the defense attorney. I said, well, first of all, he's just doing his job. My guess is, and I'd heard before, they may have had a plea agreement, but because the federal government, the Justice Department wasn't going to sign off, they're still keeping their options open that they could charge him. And then because of that, they couldn't consummate a plea deal. As a former defense attorney, I don't blame him. I wouldn't either. I mean, why would I plead my guy and leave him open to additional charges from the federal government? Whether they would bring him or not, I think personally depends on what this verdict is. I think if he is acquitted, then I think the federal government is going to bring charges. I think the Justice Department would then indict him and bring some type of federal charges against him. If he is convicted and say gets the maximum sentence, my guess is they may not. Okay, it's kind of the reverse of what we saw in the Nassar case, where Dr. Nassar initially pled in federal court to child pornography charges and got a 60-year sentence. Then you may wonder, well, why would you bring the other charges where he got 40. I mean, he's not going anywhere. This was the opposite. And my guess is that they went to trial in the Nassar case. They frankly didn't have anything to lose. But sometimes you have to be careful when you're going to trial, because sometimes the facts are just so bad, you really don't want the judge to hear them, at least in any detail, okay, because that's going to have an effect on them when they have a sentence. It's one thing when you plead them and you give, and I always had my client would always give the bare minimum in terms of facts to get the plea through. Now, you know what? You get a pre-sentence report and it has some of the more facts in it, but that's on paper. That's different than somebody sitting there on the witness stand and being emotional with it. But, you know, we'll have to see what the experts for the defense, either next week or whenever their case starts, what they come up with. But I think today was pretty powerful. Dr. Chauvin was such a great witness. Usually people like this, sometimes, you know, let's face it, some people in that profession, they can be arrogant, they can be cocky. This guy was so down to earth, it was crazy. At point in times, he was telling people, the jury, if you put your hand here and feel here, you can feel this bone. And the commentators were saying that there were jurors in the courtroom doing it. I mean, they were following right along with this doctor, with what he was saying. That's powerful, okay? He had that jury right here. Now, the defense had objected, and the judge told the jury, well, you know, those of you who don't want to do this, you don't have to. It's up to you. But to the extent that you had a lot of jurors doing that, he had the jurors right here. And they were listening, and they were on top of it. So that's today's summary on the trial, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. Have a great evening.